November 24, 1987. A rural ditch off a back road near Alger, Washington, just south of Bellingham. A passerby finds the body of a young woman lying at the bottom of a wooded embankment, partially clothed, shot once in the back of the head. Her hands still show marks from the plastic zip ties used to bind them. She is 18 years old. Her name is Tanya van Cuylenborg, and she has been dead for 6 days. 2 days later, 60 miles south, hunters find a young man's body in the brush near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River. He has been beaten and strangled. He is 20 years old. His name is Jay Cook, and he was Tanya's boyfriend. Whoever did this left almost nothing behind. No name, no face, no motive investigators could ever make sense of. For 31 years, the only thing detectives had was a DNA profile with no identity attached to it, logged in their files under a placeholder. Individual A. It would take 3 decades, a scientific breakthrough that didn't exist yet in 1987, and a woman who had never heard of either victim, searching her own family tree for entirely unrelated reasons, before Individual A finally got a name. This isn't just the story of how that name was found. It's the story of 2 teenagers on their first trip together, and the 31 years their families spent waiting for an answer no one thought was still coming. If you want to see how a stranger's family tree finally cracked this case open, hit like before we go on. Tanya van Cuylenborg and Jay Cook grew up in Saanich, British Columbia, a quiet suburb of Victoria on Vancouver Island, and met each other in high school, the way so many small-town couples do. By the fall of 1987, they'd been a couple for about 6 months. Jay was 20, working with his father Gordon's furnace and heating business. Tanya was 18 and had just graduated. They spent most of their free time together, trading off between each other's family homes. Jay's mother, Leona, would later say that Tanya was clearly someone special to her son, not just a girlfriend, but someone she could already picture as part of the family for years to come. Tanya's father, William, felt the same way in reverse. He had no reservations at all about the relationship and thought the two of them were simply good for each other. That mutual approval mattered more than it might sound. Both families had, in effect, already welcomed the other's child into their own home well before anyone had reason to think their kid's relationship would ever be tested by anything more serious than a curfew. The trip that would take their lives was supposed to be nothing more than an errand. Gordon Cook needed furnace parts from a supplier in Seattle, and Jay volunteered to make the drive down and back in his father's van, picking up the parts and returning home within a day or 2. He invited Tanya along, and the two of them decided to turn a boring supply run into something more. Their first trip together as a couple, an overnight adventure across the border and back. They packed for 1 night away. Neither of them had any reason to think it would be anything other than ordinary. What people who knew them would remember afterward was how unremarkable and good their lives were, right up until the moment they weren't. Tanya had just stepped out of high school into the rest of her life, still deciding what she wanted to study, still young enough that her whole future felt open in front of her. Jay was easing into the family business, learning a trade from his father, the kind of young man both families assumed would eventually take it over and, in time, hand it down to kids of his own. Neither of them had an enemy in the world, in the most literal sense anyone could establish. Investigators would spend the next 3 decades searching for someone, anyone, who had a grudge against either of them and would never find one. Whatever happened to them on that trip, everyone who has ever studied the case agrees on this much. It wasn't personal. They were simply in the wrong place, on a highway they'd never driven before, meeting someone who had never met either of them. Tanya carried a 35mm Minolta camera with her on the trip, the kind of ordinary travel companion that barely registers when you first hear about it, and then means something different once you learn that its lens would turn up 3 years later in a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon, hundreds of miles from where she was last seen alive. The body of the camera itself was never recovered, and no one was ever connected to how the lens made its way there. It's a small, strange thread in an otherwise senseless case, and like so much else about what happened to Tanya and Jay, it never fully unraveled. What it captures, though, is something true about who Tanya was at 18, a girl who brought a camera on an overnight furnace parts run, because she wanted pictures of her first real trip with the boy she loved. Subscribe now, because it took 31 years and a stranger's curiosity about her own great-grandparents to answer the question this case opens with, and you're going to want to see exactly how that happened. On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 18, 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg left Saanich in Jay's father's bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van and drove to Victoria to catch the 4 o'clock ferry to Port Angeles, Washington. The plan was simple: cross the border, drive down to Seattle, pick up the furnace parts the next morning, and be back in Canada by Thursday night. They were seen along the way, in glimpses that would later become the only map investigators had of their final hours. The couple stopped for gas and snacks in the small Mason County towns of Hoodsport and Allen as they made their way south on Highway 101 toward Bremerton, ordinary stops that gave no hint anything was wrong. That evening, they were spotted one last time, buying tickets for the 11:35 p.m. ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. After that, nothing. No one who has ever come forward remembers seeing Jay or Tanya again. Not at the ferry terminal in Seattle, not at any gas station or diner, not anywhere between the Puget Sound and the rural roads where their bodies would eventually be found. Thursday came and went with no word. By Friday, November 20th, both families had run out of patience and options. Jay and Tanya hadn't called, hadn't shown up, and hadn't been seen by anyone since the Bremerton ferry dock. The families reported them missing that day, and a search effort began on both sides of the border, coordinated between the Saanich Police Department, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and authorities in Washington state. Relatives rented a small plane, hoping to spot the distinctive copper-colored van from the air, somewhere along the route between Port Angeles and Seattle. They found nothing. For 4 more days, 2 families waited, without a single confirmed sighting, without a ransom call, without anything at all to explain where 2 ordinary young people, on an overnight errand, could simply have vanished to. 6 days after the couple disappeared, on November 24th, Tanya's body was discovered in a ditch off a rural road in Skagit County, near the small community of Alger. She had been sexually assaulted and shot once in the back of the head at close range. Her hands bore the marks of plastic zip ties. The following day, the van was found abandoned and locked in a parking lot near the bus station in downtown Bellingham, roughly 70 miles from where Jay and Tanya had last been seen. A location that would itself become a piece of the puzzle, since whoever left it there had to have some way of leaving the area afterward without a vehicle of his own. Inside it, investigators found Tanya's identification, along with items that didn't belong to either of them: zip ties, ammunition, and a surgical glove. 2 days after that, on November 26, hunters found Jay's body in brush near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River in the town of Monroe, roughly 60 miles from where Tanya had been left. He had been beaten and strangled with twine and 2 red dog collars that, like the van's other contents, belonged to no one either family could identify. His body was wrapped in a blue blanket that wasn't his. Whoever did this had planned for it. The zip ties, the glove, the means to restrain 2 people and kill them separately. None of that came together by accident on the side of a highway. Skagit County investigators would later come to believe the killer had arrived with everything he needed already packed and ready. 6 days after the couple disappeared, investigators finally had a body, and with it, the beginning of a forensic picture that emerged from 3 crime scenes spread across 3 counties. A picture that remains, even now, almost entirely circumstantial. There was no eyewitness to the abduction, no surveillance footage, nothing placing a specific person in Jay and Tanya's company after the Bremerton ferry dock. What investigators did have was biological evidence: semen recovered from the hem of Tanya's pants and from a vaginal swab taken during her autopsy, both later confirmed to be a match to the same unidentified man. An autopsy found that Tanya had died from a single close-range gunshot wound to the back of the head, what one detective, decades later, would flatly call an execution. She had rolled partway down the embankment after she was shot and was found without her pants or underwear, her bra pushed up above her breasts. Physical details that, combined with the gunshot itself, left investigators in little doubt they were looking at a rape murder. Jay's autopsy told a different story. blunt force injuries consistent with being struck by rocks, and asphyxiation from strangulation with twine and 2 dog collars that belonged to neither victim. Investigators believed the 2 of them had been separated and killed in different ways, in different places, which meant Jay was very likely killed first, before his body and the van made their way toward Bellingham and Monroe. The physical evidence collected from the van itself only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Beyond the zip ties, ammunition, and surgical glove, investigators lifted 4 fingerprints from inside the vehicle that belonged to neither victim, prints they would carry, unmatched, for the next 30 years. Additional evidence turned up under the back porch of a tavern near the Bellingham bus station, not far from where the van had been abandoned, suggesting the killer had spent at least some time on foot in that immediate area after leaving it there. Tanya's identification was still inside the van when it was found, along with her missing 35mm camera's whereabouts, left entirely unexplained. Its lens would not surface until 1990, in a pawn shop across the state line in Portland, Oregon, with no link to any suspect ever established. Investigators from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office took the lead on Jay's case, while the Skagit County Sheriff's Office led the investigation into Tanya's death, with the 2 departments coordinating closely given how directly the cases were linked. In the earliest days, before anyone had reason to think otherwise, investigators reportedly gave some consideration to whether Jay himself could have been involved in Tanya's death, a line of inquiry both families rejected outright, and one that evidence would ultimately rule out entirely once it became clear he had been murdered as well, his own body found 2 days after hers, far from where she'd been left. From there, the case became what cold case detectives sometimes describe as a true stranger crime. No ex-boyfriend to clear, no jealous co-worker, no family conflict to trace. Just 2 teenagers and a killer that none of the roughly 500 people investigators eventually spoke with over 3 decades could identify. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 500 interviews, conducted across 2 counties and 2 countries over 30 years, and not one of them led anywhere. Detectives canvassed truck stops and ferry terminals along the route Jay and Tanya had driven. They tracked down and cleared known sex offenders in the region. They chased leads generated by media coverage every time the case resurfaced in the press, and came up empty every single time. It's the kind of exhaustive, grinding police work that rarely makes it into the retelling of a case like this, precisely because none of it worked. But it's also exactly why, when investigators finally did get a name in 2018, nobody could quite believe how ordinary and unconnected to any of it that name turned out to be. Detectives did have one piece of technology working in their favor, even if it would take decades to matter: a full DNA profile, developed from the semen evidence using the testing methods available by the 1990s. They ran it against every criminal database they had access to. Repeatedly, for years, it never matched anyone. Whoever left that DNA at the scene had never been arrested for anything serious enough to end up in a system built to catch repeat offenders, which meant, as far as 1980s and 1990s forensic science was concerned, he was functionally invisible. By the early 1990s, without a suspect, without a weapon, and without a single credible tip that led anywhere, the case had gone as cold as a cold case can go. The file didn't close. Snohomish and Skagit County detectives kept it active, technically, for the next 3 decades. But for all practical purposes, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg joined the ranks of the truly unsolved, a DNA profile with no name, sitting in an evidence freezer, waiting for a kind of science that hadn't been invented yet. Prosecutors would eventually describe the killings, in later court filings, as being as random as they were savage, a description that captures just how little the original investigation had to work with. There was no ransom demand, no theft that made sense as a motive, nothing stolen of any real value beyond the van itself, which was recovered within a day. Cook and Van Cuylenborg were not targeted for who they were, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine. They simply crossed paths with the wrong person on the wrong stretch of highway at the wrong hour of the night. It's worth remembering, too, just how limited forensic science actually was in 1987. DNA profiling itself was barely a few years old as an investigative tool anywhere in the world, and the sophisticated comparison techniques that would eventually crack this case were still decades from existing. Detectives in Snohomish and Skagit counties were, in effect, preserving evidence for a future they had no way of knowing would ever arrive. For the better part of 3 decades, the case moved only in fits and starts. Detectives investigated hundreds of leads over the years, reported sightings, jailhouse rumors, tips phoned in after true crime television specials, and cleared every one of them. The case was profiled on the long-running series Unsolved Mysteries, which kept it in public memory well past the point most cold cases fade from view. But even national television exposure produced no usable lead. Detectives who inherited the file across the decades each brought their own renewed effort, re-interviewing old witnesses, rechecking evidence against newly updated databases, and each time coming up with nothing new to show for it. In 2010, the case took a strange detour when a series of taunting letters, apparently from someone claiming inside knowledge of the killings, began arriving addressed to the victims' families. Snohomish County cold case detective Jim Scharf, who by then had inherited the file and would go on to lead the investigation for years afterward, treated the letter writer as a person of interest and had his DNA entered into the case database in case he turned out to be an accomplice. Skagit County Detective Tobin Meyer, working the case alongside Scharf, offered a theory about the killer that would stick with the investigation for years afterward. That he hadn't improvised anything that night, but had arrived with a kit, zip ties, a weapon, gloves, everything he needed to commit the crime and control the scene. The letter writer, whoever he was eventually ruled out as the actual killer. The DNA profile itself, still unnamed, remained the only real thread anyone had. Family members on both sides of the border spent those years in a particular kind of limbo. Not without hope, exactly, but without much reason for it either. Every few years brought a renewed appeal, a new detective inheriting the file, a fresh round of media coverage, a new anniversary marked quietly by 2 families who had no graveside ritual to fall back on, only a case number. None of it produced a name. By the time genuine progress finally arrived, in 2017, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg had been unsolved for so long that most people who'd followed the case as young adults were now approaching middle age themselves. And Jay's and Tanya's own siblings had lived more years without them than they'd ever lived alongside them. Here is where this story breaks from the shape true crime cases usually take. There is no earlier arrest to point to, no restraining order, no pattern of escalating behavior that investigators failed to connect, no institution that looked away. William Earl Talbot II left almost no trace of himself anywhere in the historical record before 2018, and that absence turns out to be the whole story of how he evaded justice for so long. Talbot was born around 1963, the only son of William Talbot Sr. and Patricia Talbot, and grew up in the Monroe, Washington area, the same stretch of Snohomish County where Jay Cook's body would eventually be found. He was 24 years old at the time of the murders. According to accounts his own family would later give investigators and reporters, his childhood was not an easy one. His youngest sister described a brother with serious anger issues, recalling physical altercations between the 2 of them as children. She said he had kicked her hard enough, on more than one occasion, that she called the police on her own brother. Their father acknowledged arranging counseling for him after outbursts that included, by the father's account, a threat the teenage Talbot once made to run him over with a car as soon as he had his license. The counseling, by his father's own telling, didn't seem to change much. Whether any of that childhood behavior ever escalated toward the kind of violence he stood accused of in 1987 is something no one has ever been able to establish. It's simply what the people closest to him remembered when reporters eventually came asking, decades after the fact, trying to understand who this stranger actually was. What the public record actually shows about William Talbot's adult life prior to his arrest is almost aggressively ordinary. He earned his commercial driver's license and spent roughly 20 years working as a short-haul truck driver in the Puget Sound region, the same region where he had lived his entire life. He had no criminal record of any significance. The one blemish on file was a charge of indecent exposure, unconnected to this case in any way investigators were ever able to establish, and never treated by prosecutors as evidence of anything beyond itself. He married, had a family of his own, and by every outward appearance, settled into the kind of unremarkable, working-class life that draws no attention from anyone. He was never flagged by a single tip in 3 decades of appeals for information, was never questioned by police in connection with the murders, and his name never once surfaced in the case file until a genealogist traced it there in 2018. No co-worker, neighbor, or acquaintance ever called in his name. He simply worked, lived, and drove trucks through the same part of Washington state for 2 more decades, entirely unremarkable to everyone around him, while the DNA he'd left behind in 1987 sat unmatched in a state crime lab less than an hour from where he slept every night. It's worth being direct about what this means for the shape of this story. There is no earlier offense to walk through here, no lightly punished precursor crime that, in hindsight, should have raised alarms. If there were warning signs in William Talbot's life before 1987, or between 1987 and 2018, nobody who might have seen them has ever come forward to describe them, and the accuracy of this account depends on saying so plainly rather than inventing a pattern that was never actually documented. There's no institutional failure to point to either, no department that had his name and sat on it, the way investigators in some cold cases eventually discover. Nobody protected William Talbot, because as far as the record shows, nobody in a position to protect him ever had a reason to. What ultimately identified him wasn't a mistake he made in plain sight, and it wasn't a system failing to connect dots that were already there to connect. It was a piece of his own genetic code, inherited from grandparents he likely never gave much thought to, sitting quietly in the DNA of relatives who had no idea what it might someday reveal. Prosecutors never offered the jury a tidy motive, because there wasn't one available to offer. Talbot's defense would later argue at trial that he'd simply encountered Tanya somewhere along her route, and the two had consensual sex, an account that, if true, still left entirely unexplained why she ended up dead, why Jay was killed separately 60 miles away, and why the scene was staged to look like a robbery when nothing of real value was taken. The state's theory, by contrast, never pretended to fully explain what drove Talbot to do what he did. It simply laid out what the evidence showed: a stranger who intercepted 2 travelers on an unfamiliar road, killed one of them at close range and the other by beating and strangulation, and vanished back into an ordinary life so completely that not one person who crossed his path for the next 31 years ever thought to wonder about him. By 2018, Talbot was 55 years old, still driving trucks, still living quietly in the Seattle area. He had, as far as any investigator could determine, simply gone on with an unremarkable life for 31 years after leaving 2 teenagers dead in the Washington countryside. There's a particular kind of unease that a case like this leaves behind, one that's different from the cover-up stories and jealous lover stories that make up so much of true crime. Those cases at least offer a kind of grim logic. Someone was known, someone had a motive, someone's behavior was flagged and ignored. This one offers almost none of that comfort. William Talbot wasn't hiding in plain sight because anyone protected him, or because anyone missed the warning signs. He was hiding in plain sight because there simply weren't any signs to miss. He was, by his own family's later account, a man who could be volatile behind closed doors decades earlier, and, by every account of the neighbors, co-workers, and fellow drivers who spent the following 31 years around him, otherwise entirely forgettable. Both things, apparently, were true of the same person. In 2017, Snohomish County Detective Jim Scharf learned about a Virginia-based company called Parabon Nanolabs, which had developed a technique called DNA phenotyping, analyzing a genetic profile to predict what its owner might actually look like, based on statistical correlations between genetic markers and physical traits like skin tone, eye color, and face shape. It was, at the time, one of the only tools available for turning crime scene DNA into any kind of visual lead when no criminal database match existed. Scharf hired Parabon to run the process on individual A's decades-old DNA. What came back was a set of composite images, computer-generated predictions of the suspect's face at ages 25, 45, and 65, built from statistical models correlating specific genetic markers with traits like skin tone, eye color, and face shape. The predictions weren't guesses in the traditional sense. Parabon's geneticists had trained their models by comparing roughly 800,000 individual points of variation across the human genome against thousands of real faces, looking for patterns reliable enough to translate DNA into a plausible likeness. Scharf released the images publicly in April of 2018, hoping someone would recognize the face. Nobody did. It was, at best, an educated guess rendered in pixels, useful for narrowing a search, but nowhere near definitive enough to name a killer, and a reminder of just how far the technology still had to go before it could put an actual name on individual A. Then, weeks later, everything about what was possible with old DNA changed. In April 2018, investigators in California announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the suspected Golden State Killer, using a technique nobody had successfully applied to a criminal case before: genetic genealogy. Instead of comparing crime scene DNA against a criminal database, which only works if the perpetrator's DNA is already on file from a prior arrest or conviction, investigators had uploaded it to GEDmatch, a free public genealogy website where ordinary people upload their own DNA to research their family history. The DNA didn't need to belong to a criminal for this to work. It only needed to be similar enough to DNA already sitting in the database, uploaded by an unsuspecting relative, with no idea their genetic information could ever be used this way. A second cousin's worth of shared DNA was more than enough to start building a family tree backward toward a name. Parabon had already built a full genetic profile of individual A while producing those composite sketches, so pivoting to genetic genealogy took days rather than months. The company brought in CeCe Moore, a genealogist known for her work tracing family trees on the PBS series Finding Your Roots. This would be her first criminal case, and she has since said she wasn't entirely certain, going in, that it was the right thing for her to be doing at all. Moore uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch and found 2 matches, distant cousins of whoever had left that DNA at the crime scenes in 1987. One of them was a woman named Chelsea Rustad. Rustad had no connection to this case at all. In 2013, curious that she didn't even know her own great-grandparents' names, she'd begun casually researching her family tree online, eventually connecting with a cluster of distant cousins in Snohomish County, among them 2 sisters she exchanged messages with, and a brother, William Earl Talbot II, who had no social media presence and seemed, in her own later description, almost invisible online. Odd, she remembers thinking at the time, though not odd enough to dwell on. In 2015, with no idea any of it would ever matter to a criminal investigation, she uploaded her DNA results to GEDmatch, simply to keep building out her family history, the same way tens of thousands of other curious amateur genealogists were doing that same year, for the same unremarkable reasons. Working from Rustad's family tree and one other distant match, Moore was able to trace the connections back to a single household, William and Patricia Talbot of Monroe, Washington, and their only son. Genealogists sometimes describe this kind of triangulation as working backward from the branches of a tree to its trunk. In this case, it took Moore roughly 2 hours to reach a name she was confident enough in to hand to detectives. Detectives still needed to confirm it without tipping him off. Talbot was, after all, a private citizen with a family and no criminal history. And if the genetic match turned out to be wrong, a premature approach could ruin an innocent man's life and destroy the department's credibility on top of it. In early May 2018, an undercover surveillance team began quietly watching William Talbot, waiting for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample he'd throw away voluntarily. No warrant required for genetic material someone discards in public, since abandoning trash carries no expectation of privacy under the law. They didn't have to wait long. A paper cup fell from Talbot's truck cab, and officers recovered it before he ever noticed it was gone. The DNA on it was sent to the state crime lab for comparison against the sample that had waited, unmatched, since 1987. For Jim Scharf, who had spent years by that point personally invested in a case most people assumed would simply outlive everyone still trying to solve it, the days waiting on that lab result were unlike anything else in his career. He had built composite sketches that led nowhere. He had chased a taunting letter writer who turned out to be a dead end. He had watched the file get passed from detective to detective for 3 decades, each one eventually reaching retirement or reassignment without an answer. Genetic genealogy wasn't a guarantee. It hadn't been battle-tested in a single American courtroom yet when Scharf decided to pursue it. But it was, for the first time in 30 years, an actual lead rather than another dead end. The comparison came back positive. The DNA on the discarded cup matched the genetic profile recovered from Tanya van Cuylenborg's body in 1987, the same profile that had sat, unmatched against any criminal database, for 3 decades. To close any remaining gap, forensic scientists at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, including analyst Lisa Collins, later obtained a direct cheek swab from Talbot himself and ran the comparison again. Both times, the result was the same match, at a level of certainty that left essentially no room for coincidence. Collins would later testify that although some of the original 1987 evidence had degraded after 3 decades in storage, degradation alone doesn't corrupt a DNA profile or create a false identification. It simply breaks the sample down. It doesn't change what it says. On the morning of May 17, 2018, Detective Jim Scharf and other officers approached Talbot as he climbed down from his semi-truck cab in the Seattle area. Scharf identified himself as being from the sheriff's office. Talbot initially refused to hand over identification, and when officers told him he was being placed under arrest on suspicion of first-degree murder, he wouldn't turn around or put his hands behind his back at first. A brief, tense standoff before officers were able to take him into custody without further incident. He was 55 years old, booked the next day, and formally charged with the murder of Tanya van Cuylenborg, a second count, for Jay Cook's murder, followed within days, along with additional charges tied to the kidnapping and robbery investigators believed had accompanied the killings. Bail was set at $2 million, a figure reflecting both the severity of the charges and the very real flight risk, a man facing a life sentence, after 3 decades of freedom, now represented. Reaction across 2 countries was immediate. Snohomish County Sheriff Ty Trenary told reporters that his department had never given up hope of finding Jay and Tanya's killer, calling the arrest proof of what new DNA technology could do when combined with detectives who refused to let a case go. Tanya's brother, John van Cuylenborg, stood at the press conference where the arrest was formally announced, describing a mixture of relief, joy, and renewed sorrow all at once. The answer he and his family had waited 3 decades for, arriving all together with the fresh grief of having to relive why they'd needed it. Jay's family, gathered alongside the Van Cuylenborgs that day, felt much the same, having spent 31 years imagining this moment without ever quite believing it would come. For the first time since 1987, Individual A had a face, a name, and an address. A truck driver who had spent 2 decades hauling freight through the same towns where he'd once left 2 teenagers dead, never once drawing a second look from anyone. Talbot's own defense attorney, in the days after the arrest, described her new client to reporters as an ordinary blue-collar man who had lived what she called a quiet, unremarkable life, a description nobody involved in the case, on either side, ever seriously disputed. That, more than almost anything else about this story, is what made it so unsettling to the people who'd spent 3 decades searching for him. Whatever they had pictured, across 31 years of theorizing about the kind of man capable of this, it almost certainly wasn't a truck driver with a wife, a family, and 2 decades of clean employment records, quietly passing through the same small towns where he'd once left 2 teenagers dead. William Talbot's trial opened in Snohomish County Superior Court in June 2019, before Judge Linda Crease, 31.5 years after Jay Cook and Tanya van Cuylenborg disappeared. Jury selection alone took the better part of a week. Potential jurors were questioned at length about their ability to weigh forensic DNA evidence fairly, a process complicated by just how much national press the case had already drawn. Reporters from across the country, and from Canadian outlets covering the case for Jay and Tanya's home province, filled the courtroom gallery most days, aware that whatever happened here would set a precedent well beyond Snohomish County. It was, by that point, More than just a murder trial, it was the first criminal case in the world where a defendant identified through genetic genealogy would actually stand trial in front of a jury, rather than pleading guilty, as the Golden State Killer suspect ultimately would. Chief Criminal Deputy Matt Baldock, the lead prosecutor, made a deliberate strategic choice going in. Rather than let the case become a referendum on the novel science that had identified Talbot, he tried to keep the genetic genealogy itself in the background, focusing the jury instead on the far simpler, harder-to-dispute fact of the DNA match itself. Prosecutors opened their case by walking the jury through the specifics of Jay and Tanya's final trip: the ferry tickets, the gas station stops, the last confirmed sighting at the Bremerton dock, establishing, piece by piece, just how little was actually known about what happened between that night and the discovery of Tanya's body 6 days later. They called witnesses who had crossed paths with the couple that evening, reconstructing a timeline that, even after 2 years of trial preparation, still ran out at the ferry terminal and picked back up only with the discovery of 2 bodies. Defense attorney Rachel Ford, with co-counsel John Scott, built her case around a single alternative explanation: that Talbot's DNA on Tanya's body proved only that they'd had consensual sex, not that he'd killed her or Jay. During jury selection, Ford asked prospective jurors directly whether they assumed a young woman traveling with her boyfriend would never have consensual sex with a stranger, laying the groundwork for the argument to come, and signaling early on just how much of the trial would hinge on what jurors were willing to infer from DNA evidence alone, absent an eyewitness or a confession. Prosecutors called forensic scientist Lisa Collins to walk the jury through the DNA evidence and explain why 3 decades of storage hadn't compromised its reliability. A degraded sample, she testified, doesn't create some kind of false or phantom profile that could point to the wrong person. It simply breaks down without altering what the remaining genetic material actually says. Detective Jim Scharf testified about Talbot's arrest, describing his initial refusal to cooperate when officers identified themselves and placed him under arrest. Deputy Prosecutor Matt Baldock showed jurors a photograph of the paper coffee cup that had first linked Talbot's discarded DNA to the crime scene evidence. The state also highlighted physical evidence tying Talbot to the van itself: a palm print found on its rear window, connecting him not just to Tanya's body, but to the vehicle used to move it, and Jay's body across 3 counties. On cross-examination and in closing, Ford pushed hard on what investigators hadn't been able to explain. No murder weapon was ever recovered. Talbot had never been known to own or express interest in firearms, and several fingerprints found in the van were never matched to him or to anyone else. Neither his DNA nor his fingerprints turned up anywhere else in the van, despite what the defense called exhaustive searching and testing. She argued detectives had fixated on the DNA match to the exclusion of every other possibility, accusing Scharf of tunnel vision once the genetic genealogy pointed his way. She also reminded jurors that Talbot had lived his entire life in the same small corner of Washington state, a father and a husband, with no history of violence toward anyone he'd ever actually been in a relationship with. The portrait, she argued, of a man who simply didn't fit what the state was asking the jury to believe he'd done. Baldock's response was direct. If Talbot's account were true, it would mean Tanya got dressed again after consensual sex, only for a second, still unidentified person to find her, undress her, and kill her. A sequence of events he asked the jury to weigh against the far simpler explanation the evidence actually supported. Talbot did not testify in his own defense, and sat through most of the 2-week trial showing little visible reaction to the testimony against him. In their own closing argument, prosecutors asked jurors to consider what Jay and Tanya's lives might have looked like had they lived, the kind of appeal to sympathy that, years later, Talbot's appellate lawyers would argue had crossed a line. At trial, though, it landed as intended, a reminder, after 2 weeks of forensic testimony and DNA statistics, that the case was ultimately about 2 specific people who never got to grow up. Baldock also told jurors, in rebuttal, that the decision they were about to make would carry weight far beyond the courtroom. For Talbot, for the families who had waited 3 decades, and for everyone who had ever loved Jay Cook or Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Throughout the 2-week trial, Talbot's defense team also raised objections that would resurface years later on appeal, including a challenge to how the prosecution's closing argument invoked the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s in discussing the era the murders took place in. Material Ford argued had no basis in the actual trial record and served only to prejudice the jury. At the time, those objections were overruled, and the trial continued. It would be several more years before any appellate court weighed in on whether they mattered. After roughly 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted William Talbot II on both counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Under Washington law, the conviction carried a single possible sentence, and on July 24, 2019, Judge Crace sentenced him to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Talbot addressed the court himself before sentencing, maintaining his innocence and insisting he had never in his life been a violent person, telling the judge the level of violence attributed to him was something he couldn't even comprehend. His own father and 2 sisters were not present in the courtroom that day. 4 men believed to be his friends were. The only member of his extended family who did attend was Chelsea Rustad, the second cousin whose curiosity about her own family tree had led investigators to his door in the first place, sitting between John Van Cuylenborg and Jay's father Gordon, in support of the victims' families rather than his own relative. Jay's mother, Leona, told the judge about the particular, physical texture of 31 years of grief. Some families who lose a child to violence, she said, are at least left with something of theirs to hold on to. You could put them to your nose and smell him. The Cook and Van Cuylenborg families had waited 3 decades, even for that. The legal story didn't end with sentencing. In December 2021, a Washington appeals court overturned both of Talbot's convictions, not over any doubt about the genetic genealogy or the DNA itself, but because a seated juror had told the court during jury selection that her own history with domestic violence might make it hard for her to stay impartial and should have been dismissed. Prosecutors immediately signaled they'd fight the ruling and, if necessary, retry the case from scratch. They didn't have to. In December 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reversed the appeals court and reinstated both convictions, ruling that Talbot's own trial team had forfeited the right to challenge that juror on appeal, since they'd had an unused peremptory strike available and chosen not to use it. The case was sent back to the appeals court to address the arguments it hadn't yet reached, and in early 2024, that court affirmed the convictions again, rejecting Talbot's remaining challenges. A further petition to the state Supreme Court was denied later that year, more than 3 decades after the murders, and roughly 5 years after the original verdict. William Talbot's convictions stood as final. Chelsea Rustad never distanced herself from the case that made her, however unwillingly, a small piece of forensic history. She became an advocate for the responsible use of investigative genetic genealogy, and in 2020 published a memoir, Inherited Secrets, about learning that her own DNA had helped identify a killer in her extended family. Detective Jim Scharf, who spent much of his career chasing this single case, has said plainly that without genetic genealogy, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg might simply never have been solved at all. Their case, alongside the Golden State Killer investigation happening in California at almost exactly the same time, helped establish the template that has since been used to identify suspects and victims in hundreds of other cold cases across the country. None of that changes what this story actually is, underneath the legal history and the science. Jay Cook was 20 years old, learning his father's trade, days away from what should have been an unremarkable errand and back home again. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18, freshly out of high school, on the first real trip she'd ever taken with someone she loved. They were not looking for anything more than furnace parts and a night away together. Whatever else this case became, a scientific milestone, a legal precedent, a story told and retold across 3 decades. It began as 2 families losing their kids on a highway between 2 countries, and ended as 2 more families, on opposite sides of a courtroom, finding a strange kind of grace in each other, 31 years later. If this case affected you, share it with someone who needs to hear their names. And subscribe, because there are more families out there still waiting for their own individual A to finally get a name. Thanks for watching.